All right, everyone, ready to go with part 3 of the 6-part series on the ACM assessment program. Today's topic is on the backward bend assessment. And if you are familiar with the ACM assessment program, you'll know that the backward bend is the third assessment we use in the protocol. And let me share the screen so you can see what we're doing. I'll go through the slide deck, which is a lot of great information, and I think some things that you may even take into consideration or may have even not taken into consideration. So when we're looking at the backward bend pattern, it follows the ankle mobility and toe touching pattern. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But why is the backward bend pattern so critical? If you think about the majority of the day spent doing the activities that we do, I always look at kind of on a time frame. Wake up in the morning, we usually sit down. If you eat breakfast, we should be eating breakfast. We're usually sitting down. It's the average commute in Orange County and LA is around 30 minutes. So we're sitting for 30 minutes to work. We usually go to work and sit down, come back from work sitting down, and then head home for dinner or out for dinner, and we're sitting down. Even though we may perform exercise and do our activities of daily living and do our workouts, the amount of time spent in the sitting position has some implications on our body mechanics, our posture, and muscles that are tight, short, restricted, inactive, overactive. Robert McKenzie wrote a book called Treat Your Back. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. It was back in the he pioneered kind of the back rehab movement in the 80s or mid 90s, and one of the things he talked about in his Treat Your Own Back book was that if all of us were to do a backward bend like a child every day, we'd probably never develop back problems, because he related a lot of the back conditions to the sedentary lifestyle that our society was leading to. And so this in turn led to a famous exercise that was named after him, the McKenzie exercise, which is basically a cobra. You're just trying to roll yourself up into that cobra position. And this was used a lot in the rehab of herniated discs, the idea of pushing that disc back into space by increasing extension. So if you don't think the backward bend pattern is important, or if you're not using it as an assessment tool, think again, because it's a critical component to human movement, and really especially our human movement in today's society, because of what we do all day with our bodies. So the backward bend pattern, again, it's a bilateral assessment, just like the toe touching pattern, and we're really looking from that coronal view, the side view, as to how far someone can move. And just some elements that we're going to get into a little more detail of are the shoulder flexion, lumbar extension, hip external rotation, thoracic extension, and the center of gravity distribution, which we don't. Let me put this back up here: thoracic extension in that order: shoulders, thoracic, lumbar, hip external rotation, and then distribution of center of gravity as someone bends into backward bend, similar to what we talked about in the toe touching pattern. On the software, the ACM assessment software, you'll notice that there are two components that we're really looking at in the assessment of the backward bend. And one of those is the ASIS, the anterior superior iliac spine. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's the little bones in front of the hip, on the pelvis, that we feel. And what we're looking at is kind of a general rule that the hip should pass forward to the toes as we bend backward. And then the spine of the scapula, imagine where the scapula is, that long ridge of the scapula, flat part of the scapula, should pass back far enough so that it drops below the heel, behind the heels. So we'll get into each of these in a lot more detail, but I just want to share with you how the software works. They either can or they can't bend forward far enough with their hips, and they either can or they can't bend backwards far enough with their thoracic back. We can isolate those. Maybe they're moving too far with one and not the other. But in this example, they can move. They have really good backward bend pattern. Their hips come forward. They have great thoracic extension. Their scapula passes back over the heels. So we give them 2 yeses. And with 2 yeses, the computer will ask you how difficult it was. in this example, it was a 4. Anything less than 4 or less, it will always kick you back with a functional result. Okay, let me go to the next slide. If we have a yes and yes, they can do this, but it was really difficult. You saw them struggling, you saw them losing their balance, or it's really tight. A 5 or greater, the result is a dysfunctional pattern. It's not authentic. If we have a no and no for the thoracic or the ASIS hip extension and the thoracic extension, meaning the scapula behind the knees, then there's no chance, there's no choice of difficulty, because it's already difficult enough. It automatically comes back as a dysfunctional pattern. If you have one of those reversed, their hips pass forward, but they're extremely tight in their upper back, then it's a dysfunctional. Even if you chose yes on the ASIS, it still doesn't give you the option to choose a difficulty because they're not able to do it anyway. So that's a dysfunctional. And switch the parameters. They are not able to move in their hip. They have great thoracic extension. That will result in a DF. Again, no option for the difficulty because they are not able to do it. So that's how the software works. Pretty straightforward. When you understand what to look for and you see enough of this, you'll start really understanding true hip extension and true thoracic extension is what we're really looking for in this pattern. So moving on, I mentioned earlier that the backward bend is the third assessment in this ACM assessment protocol. And there's a reason why I've grouped them this way, because as we move from one pattern to the next, they're building on each other. And I mentioned these are not isolated patterns. Each pattern has an implication on the other. And as we grow the understanding of these patterns, as we do an assessment, the information we're gathering from these assessments leads us to some predictions as we can expect to find in these other patterns, or you might just call it a theory, and the next pattern is to really assess that theory. So what I mean by that is when we do ankle mobility and then toe touching, we get some understandings as to, let me just show you, we do an ankle mobility test, we're looking at functional, dysfunctional, or symmetrical, how much of the ankle move. We move to the toe touching pattern, now we're looking at functional or dysfunctional, and if we're observing an asymmetrical dysfunction. Now from those two assessments, we have to understand what the backward bend pattern is really going to show us, or what we're looking for. And if we don't have ankle mobility, we can almost assume, we can predict that they may have a difficulty in a backward bend pattern, because in order to bend backwards, the ankle has to go into dorsiflexion. So they may have some restrictions there if you found it in the ankle mobility. On the toe touching pattern, we'll talk a little bit more about this later in some slides. If someone has excessive thoracic kyphosis, we mentioned this in the toe touching pattern, you might be predicting, or you might assume that they may have a very difficult time getting thoracic extension. Don't just assume that that's the case. Just keep an eye on it, because I've seen a lot of people with really excessive thoracic kyphosis have tremendous extension abilities and rotational abilities in the thoracic back. So it starts to tell us that if someone has excessive kyphosis or thoracic kyphosis in a toe-touching pattern, meaning their upper back really rounds, like we'll show you the pictures, and they have great range of motion and extension, backward bend, then we start understanding this is a weakness problem. This is it could be where the body works very well, and it may not be necessary they need to stretch this area. So the patterns build on each other. Just keep that in mind. And as we move through those patterns, start understanding that they're starting to predict the new pattern, or at least gives you an assessment, a way to differentiate an assessment, or come up with a new, or it gives you a way to predict what the next movement pattern is going to be, and it validates your theory, or it will not, and it will start leading you to the right answers. So when it comes to the backward bend pattern, I look at two components of this. The first part is I always observe how well someone can raise their arms overhead and where their body's at relative to where they started, and then how well they can stay in that position. And then we go into the backward bend pattern. So it's actually a two-part assessment: the raising the arms up overhead and the backward bend. So I mentioned it earlier, just so you can see this a better visual. This guy had tremendous backward bend pattern mobility. His ASIS is way out in front of his toes. The red lines represent the markers that we're looking for. his hips are, he's got very good hip extension mobility. And his spine of the scapula is far back behind his heels. He's got tremendous extension ability in his thoracic back. And so this would be considered a pass or functional with a difficulty of 0 or 4. His was like 0, -0 for difficulty. Let's take a look at the elements of the backward bends so you can start putting some of these pieces together. We're not just looking at one thing, we're looking at many things. And that's why each one of these movement patterns can really help us see a lot more than what we're actually seeing on the surface. The first thing I mentioned, I look at shoulder flexion. And I'm looking to see if the person actually has the ability to raise their arms overhead. If someone actually has the ability to raise their arms standing overhead into a 180-degree shoulder flexion position. Now you have to ask yourself, if they don't, is this a shoulder girdle, something related to shoulder joint, shoulder girdle, meaning the musculature of the shoulder, restriction, or is this a thoracic extension restriction? And again, based on what you saw in the toe touching pattern, you might start thinking it might be thoracic if you saw a really excessive thoracic kyphosis. So, but it gives you a question, it makes you have to ask, which direction is that going? We have the other assessments that will give us a better, clear understanding of, is it a shoulder girdle extension problem, or is it a shoulder girdle restriction problem, or is it a thoracic extension problem? Again, we're looking at thoracic extension in this pattern. The kyphosis, how is it a stiff, rigid position of this thoracic spine? Is the shoulder girdle involved in this? Because again, your shoulder girdle attaches to your thoracic area, the majority of it does. Is it because of a restriction in hip extension? And you kind of have to be able to tell. If someone doesn't have hip extension, they're not going to be able to get the back to go backward into extension because of the center of gravity, and that's why I have the center of gravity orientation as that next one. If the center of gravity orientation isn't has the ability to reestablish balance, and they're not going to be able to balance, they're going to keep in the thoracic, they're going to keep their back from going backwards because they're going to lose balance. So taking those things into consideration, don't just assume that they have a tight back. There could be other components to this. Lumbar extension, if you're seeing excessively tight or excessive lumbar extension or lordosis, it could be an indication of tight hip flexors. An ankle mobility restriction this is again, ankle mobility restrictions create kinetic chain dysfunction of that group, and it could be because they have ankle mobility restrictions because they're not able to move their ankles. They have to find that movement somewhere else. Again, thoracic restrictions and shoulder joint restrictions, as well as weak abdominals. They just don't have the ability to bend backwards and stabilize that movement. So if you're seeing lumbar extension or excessive lordosis, which you're going to see, you're going to get extension in the lumbar spine. But if it's really kind of like we talked about in the toe touching pattern, if there's not a symmetrical pattern of spinal extension, you want to start thinking about what could be, why that lumbar spine is going into excessive extension. We mentioned the center of gravity orientation. Basically, that center of gravity has to stay balanced between the toe or over the toes. As the hips move forward and the spine, upper back moves back, that center of gravity is reestablishing itself. So someone could have just really poor core stability and have great mobility throughout these patterns, but their core stability is what's leaving them with an inability to create a good movement pattern visual. Hip extension, obviously, we're looking at hip extension. We'll talk about that in more detail. But we're looking at how far that hip goes into extension, and I'll give you the parameters on how to measure that. And that could be an indication of tight hip flexors, and we'll talk about what that is, as well as some other things. And then obviously dorsiflexion, we mentioned it many times. I never go away from the dorsiflexion or the ankle mobility assessment because it is implicated in so many things. But poor hip extension could be a result of poor dorsiflexion. If they can't bend at their ankles, they're not going to be able to get any further in the movement of the hips. It may not even be a hip extension problem. It may just be poor ankle mobility, or the poor hip extension is causing poor ankle mobility. So we have to kind of be able to differentiate those two. As I talked about, let's look at the initial position, the phase 1 of this assessment, which is the shoulder flexion, bringing the arms up. And you can see this gentleman, his arm isn't quite back at 180 degrees. So we have to ask ourselves, is this a shoulder problem, shoulder girdle problem, or is this a thoracic extension problem, and all those things we mentioned. But this is the first part of it, getting an idea of how far someone's arm comes back. And you should see that arm straight overhead, without a lot of bending at the elbows and almost in line with their ear. And again, when we talked about the shoulder flexion, lumbar extension, hip extension, let me change this order so you have it right. Shoulder flexion, thoracic extension, lumbar extension, hip external rotation, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then center of gravity distribution. Just the range of motion for the shoulders, so you can see full flexion over the head is 180 degrees. And if we're not achieving that, there's a reason why, and that's a dysfunction that we need to pay very close attention to and understand where it's coming from. What are the limitations in shoulder flexion? Let's go through this. I have a lot of things I want to share about this because we see a lot of thoracic compensation and shoulder issues. Let's start with the shoulder girdle restrictions, and we could be talking about a joint capsular problem and the joint, the capsule of the joint. Think of it like a shirt. Your shirt is usually, when your arm is down, the lower portion of your shirt is very baggy, and the top portion of your shirt is tight. As you raise the arm up, that lower portion of the shirt becomes stretched. It's baggy. To allow it to stretch, it can bring the arm up. So the capsule of the shoulder is very similar to that. Any kind of injuries, there's such stuff called encapsulitis, or which is like frozen shoulder. There's a lot of things that can happen with any type of injuries that occur. The shoulder capsule or the joint can result in some restrictions in that shoulder girdle. And there's some special tests that we use to determine capsular tightness, but as far as in physical therapy, but we don't have to worry about that at this point. Just kind of taking under consideration that the shoulder capsule could be implicated in the range of motion of the shoulder arm itself and the flexion. Subscapularis is an anterior muscle. It's part of the rotator cuff complex. As the arm comes up, if there's a lot of tightness in the anterior compartment of the shoulder, it can restrict flexion, bringing the arm overhead. The long head of the tricep, I hope everyone understands, tricep means three muscles of the tricep. As the arm comes overhead, the long head of your tricep, everyone thinks the tricep is just, well, I don't know if everyone does, but I've heard this at the gym countlessly, that it doesn't matter where your arm is because the tricep doesn't affect the shoulder. Well, the long head of the tricep attaches to the scapula. So that means as the arm comes overhead, that tricep is being stretched. And a tightness of that tricep can limit shoulder flexion. The latissimus dorsi, teres major, and teres minor. We'll just talk about this. Latissimus dorsi and teres major are the two huge adductors and extensors of the abductors and extensors of the shoulder. And again, the exact opposite movement, flexion, is going to create a lot of tightness in these lats, or the lat can restrict the shoulder flexion. So is a teres major if there's tightness in these two muscles, which they tend to be very strong and tight on a lot of people. So let's keep that in mind. And we're going to talk a little bit more about latissimus dorsi in a second. Teres major or teres minor, it's a posterior rotator cuff muscle. It's oriented low enough where it can have some implications in restricting that shoulder flexion. And then obviously the scapulohumeral rhythm. What we mean by that is the effectiveness of the arm to come up and the scapula to swing outward versus raising upward. And this is going down a really deep path into shoulder functioning that we're going to talk about later in the series. But I just want to give you an idea that there's a lot going on as the arm comes overhead, and don't just assume it's a tight shoulder joint or it's just kyphosis, because there's a lot of stuff happening to the shoulder as it comes up, and it's a very complicated joint that we need to understand a few things about. I try to simplify as much as I can here. And obviously, a big limitation in shoulder flexion is kyphosis. Thoracic flexion or kyphosis, it's that rounding of the upper back and a restriction in that upper back. I mentioned this in the backward, the toe touching pattern series, that kyphosis can be congenital or it can be we call it functional, and regardless of it's congenital or not, we still can improve some movement of that thoracic spine, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I mentioned the musculature of the arm of the shoulder joint and going into flexion upward, and the latissimus dorsi, teres major, teres minor. The posterior delt can have some implications in that, and the triceps brachii, it's the long head of the triceps, all can restrict that forward flexion of the shoulder. And So it just gives you that representation of which musculature to be thinking of as extremely tight in the shoulder joint. And as a result, the antagonists being the anterior delt, the pectoralis major, and the triceps brachii. And I will tell you that, again, we'll get into the shoulder joint a little bit more in detail. It's one of my favorite joints to work with for that reason. It's so challenging. But the pec and the lat and the teres major, the lat, and the pectoralis have the same origin, the same insertion on the humerus, which means they all internally rotate and forward flex the shoulder. So you have to take that into consideration. The pec could have some implications in the tightness of the shoulder flexion as you go overhead. The lat muscle, I told you I was going to get back to this. The lat muscle is the only muscle of the shoulder girdle that actually attaches to the lumbar sacral fascia, or to the pelvis, the lumbar sacral pelvis. And it's something to be it's something to take into consideration. If you're seeing excessive tightness in the lat muscle because of limited shoulder flexion, you're probably going to see an influence of the lumbar curvature. So remember, we mentioned we want to be looking at lumbar curvature as someone raises their arms up. Again, these are just the beginning positions for backward bend pattern. But as that arm comes up, are you seeing a limitation in the shoulder flexion? To increase shoulder flexion, are they increasing lumbar extension? And the good position is arms, at least by the ears. His head's forward a little bit. But the lat could be a big culprit in this, and that's why we have to differentiate this. The lat being attached or originating from the lumbar sacral fascia of the low back pulls on that lumbar sacral fascia and creates an arch in our back. And it could, if you see an excessive arch in someone's back, it could be because they have thoracic tightness, could have any of those other muscles involved, but the lat is having a big pull on this, and it's probably the big culprit in this situation. So just keep that in mind. Just because someone gets their arms overhead and it's in flexion and they have excessive lumbar extension, it's probably an indication that the lats are tight, creating that movement, and you'll probably see some restriction in their thoracic extension, their spine and scapula being able to go back far enough. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's look at the implications in the thoracic back. And this is kind of interesting because kyphosis is such a common thing that we see due to the sitting postures that we assume and everything. We understand the vertebrae, but this is just a breakdown of range of motion that we'd expect to see. So if we're looking at the thoracic back, extension should be up to 45 degrees. And you get quite a bit of extension in the thoracic back from a neutral kyphotic position. It should get 45 degrees. So don't be under the assumptions because the curvature is going the other direction, we don't get any movement there. The rib cage in the thoracic area has tremendous mobility. You can look at the rotational components. Obviously, the cervical spine, I'm going to share with you why this is, but the cervical spine has a lot more rotational component than the thoracic, but it is almost double. The thoracic has almost double the range of motion as the lumbar spine does in extension and flexion, extension and rotation. And so just understand that this is why even in a lot of our tests, we look at the ability to rotate to 45 here and there, and this is where it comes from. The question is, why do we have different ranges at different locations of the spine? And it has to do with our facet joint orientations. And this is a great rendition of this. The dotted lines on this left pictures show the orientation of the facet joints. This is where basically the top vertebrae and bottom vertebrae sit together, and the facet joints, just like every joint in our body, a capsular joint has articulation with the one below it, and the orientation of that joint dictates which direction it can move the best. And you can see that the flatter or more horizontal, well, the cervical are about 45 degrees, the more horizontal these are, the more they have the ability to move. And I gave you the pattern of movement in order as to highest and lowest. In cervical, we understand has the most ability to rotate based on its orientation. It's not vertical. I mean, it's not horizontal, but it's much more so than the rest of them. Extension, flexion, and then lateral flexion. Based on the orientation of these vertebrae, they don't like to tilt to the side, but they like to go into rotation more. The thoracic back is in the middle ones. It's the kind of the, again, it's the middle set of vertebrae, and it's also in the middle range for movement. It does much better in flexion, as we know, kyphosis, than all the others, but extension is second to that as far as its ability to move. Lateral flexion, side bending, and then rotation is at the end. But when you look at the chart, you'll notice that the ranges of motion, I'll go back to it, the ranges of motion in thoracic movement is all about the same, even though you're talking about the rotational component of the thoracic back being less than the rest. It's not far off of how much range of motion it has versus the flexion ability or the extensional 50, 45, 40, and 30, whereas the cervical and lumbar have very big variations in their ability to flex, extend, rotate the range. So thoracic back has the ability to move in a lot of different directions and should be very free to move. And then obviously the lumbar spine, the facet joints are orientated almost vertically, which means they don't like to rotate at all. They're really well designed to go into flexion and extension, and not very well in lateral flexion or rotation. And again, from the chart we looked at, that's why 60 degrees of flexion in the lumbar spine, but almost 18 degrees of rotation, very minimal. So that's how the joints are orientated to move. That's why movement is really fun to watch. When you understand this at this point, you can expect to know what to see, and why the numbers for the ACM assessment are as they are. Now, when it comes to, there's another muscle that I didn't mention, is pec minor. And the pec minor attaches to the rib cage and attaches it from the shoulder, the coracoid process of the shoulder blade, the little bump in the front of the shoulder blade. And that can have a big implication in thoracic kyphosis. The tighter that is, that means the more the shoulders are rounded forward. And if you think about just poor posture, that slouching kyphotic position, that pec minor is getting into a shortened position. So you can stretch all day pec minor. You can get in there and do activation release on that pec minor. But if you're not addressing thoracic extension, then it's going to continue being pulled into that position. That pec minor gets very tight. You're not going to completely fix someone's thoracic kyphosis by stretching pec minor, but it will have a big implication in reinforcing that movement. So it's important to keep that in mind. That pec minor is a muscle that can get extremely tight. And it's usually the dominant mover in scapulohumeral rhythm, or the dominant culprit in scapulohumeral rhythm when it comes to lack of serratus anterior movement. And we'll talk about it some other time. So pec minor, just keep that in mind. If you drew a line around where the muscle attaches, it doesn't attach to the spine, it attaches to the scapula, but that scapula being part of this upper shoulder girdle, it can pull the entire torso downward into that forward flexion position. So that could also, even though it's not implicated in shoulder flexion of the joint itself, the scapulohumeral rhythm is restricted because of that tight pec minor, and it all kind of falls into place. I hope that makes sense to you guys. Real quick, looking at the posterior back muscles, just to give you an example or illustration, that the lat muscle is attached to the lumbar sacral fascia. It has a big implication on our spine's posture as far as stability and even encouraging kyphosis, as well as the three long erector spinae muscles of the back, right? The spinalis, longissimus, and the ischioclastus. And why I wanted to show you this was because from this view, they just look like these big, broad, flat muscles. We know they're not; they're round, but they're fairly symmetrical, spherical, I guess you would call it. When we look at the side view of these musculature, and I want you to think about this almost like a bow and arrow, those muscles are designed to create extension in the back, lifting the back up. Remember, the thoracic back wants to go into kyphosis, and those muscles run the entire length of the spine. So we looked at ilicostalis and longissimus, the two muscles that run all the way up and down, and spinalis does too. It's just smaller inside. But those muscles, if you imagine the attachment from their origin at the pelvis and their insertions up into the spinal rib cage and spinous processes of the upper back and neck, when we look at the side view, the tighter those muscles can get, they could create more bowing of the thoracic back and more arching of the low back. If that makes any sense, it's difficult to explain. Imagine this red line on this right picture, the black outline. That red line is essentially, it would have to be back a little bit further. I can move this line back to here, but this is where the musculature is, and obviously it rounds. But the more forward that body goes, just like in this picture of the bow and arrow, the more forward that rounds, the more those muscles are in line to be tight, and it can create tightness in the thoracic back. So just keep that in mind. The musculature, just don't want to be strengthening someone's back muscles because it can create actually more tightness in these, but it's an important component, training the posterior chain. If you have questions on this, you can always ask me. One of the things I came across in doing some research was this graph, or this post, and it talks about the dangers of the forward head position. And if you read it, it's called the domino effect. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. The head moves forward, shifting the center of gravity. This is what this author stated. To compensate, the upper body drifts forward because of that. And then to compensate for that, the upper body shifts forward of the hips, and the hips tilt forward. It becomes this forward flexed, rounded, slouched posture with big arch in the back. And I drew the arrows on the side here because you might believe that theory, but I also have seen it the other way. The more the pelvis is out of position, again, where's our center of gravity? The closer to the center of gravity the body is working, the more the influence has outside of that. So my feeling and my opinion is the opposite. The more the pelvis is out of position, the more the rest of the body is reestablishing balance. You have to understand that the spine is designed segmentally to reestablish balance as we move. And if it were a stiff rod, we would really have a hard time establishing balance, and that has to do with our vestibular system and our inner ear. So the spine is designed for that flexibility and movement to accommodate our body being out of balance all the time and to reestablish balance. So although someone would say that the head tilting forward causes, and it could, someone who's looking down, their body falls forward, but that forward head position is really a result of poor posture from the core or from the pelvis and translates up the chain. That's my opinion. There's two camps of it, and to put this into perspective, does it really matter? Because we're going to go at fixing it all. And but again, I'll tell you, if it's a forward head position you're only doing neck stretching, neck exercises, you're never going to fix it because you're not establishing the kinetic chain responsibilities below. And this is why I go about it the other direction with the green arrow. Everything starts from at least the pelvis up. So hopefully that makes sense. The thoracic back is a very complicated organ or area and elements of this movement. I wanted to show you a lot of stuff related to it that we're looking for as it relates to the assessment. So we also know that we're looking at hip extension as a result of this, and these are great examples of it. Neutral hip extension, we're looking at that nice straight posture from this coronal view. As someone's leg goes back, the lumbar spine should stay in the same position of lordosis, and that's what true hip extension is. But what tends to happen is the leg doesn't go back, but the entire pelvis tilts, which actually increases the arch of the low back. And hopefully that makes sense. These two pictures should illustrate that really well. There's a lot of, this person's drawing says 15 to 20 degrees. I haven't seen much more than 20 degrees of hip extension as a normal range of motion. It's not a lot, but it's essential that it's not coming from a compensation somewhere. The only reason I left this slide in was because it showed this other compensation. Someone whose entire pelvis comes back into hip extension like this, the torso pitches forward, and that can have it, again, that's leading to dysfunction as we were talking about, right? And then, well, we already talked about, as someone's leg goes back, the pelvis tilts and increases that lumbar curvature. So keep in mind, the backward bend is not looking at the excessiveness of, we do not want to see excessive lumbar extension even though you're going to see that as they bend backward. You just have to be able to differentiate that, which is why we want the ASIS to pass forward with a understanding of what we're supposed to find in the spine as a result. So what are the limitations in hip extension? First of all, I'll tell you that the hip socket can be very limited in its ability to function. And again, any kind of capsular injury, any kind of injury to the hip can result in some capsulitis or tightness of that hip socket. I showed in my toe touching session, I'm going to bring this up here so you can see it. The hip ligaments, we'll go back to this slide. The hip joint restrictions can be associated to hip capsular tightness of the hip socket. And there are some exercises and things you can do to increase range of motion of the hip socket, the capsule. We'll look at that. And then obviously the hip musculature. And tight abdominals can have an impact. Even though it's above the hip joint, it's attached to the pelvis. That tightness of the abdominals can have an impact in their ability to get a lack of hip extension. Although it's not really tied to the hip socket itself. And there's nothing wrong with tight abdominals because that stabilizes lumbar extension, but just keep that in mind because it's part of the anterior chain that we're looking at. Hip flexor tightness, and this is the primary culprit. Tight psoas and iliacus, your primary hip flexors. And then your secondary hip flexors are your adductors. All these muscles can contribute to tight hip extension, as well as rectus femoris, which is considered a secondary hip flexor, and sartorius. You can argue that maybe some TFL or glute medius because it does have some hip flexion component, anterior portions of it. But these are your big culprits here. And I should add one more point in here. We've talked about it before. The center of gravity distribution could also have an impact. Someone's not willing to move into extension because they just don't have the ability to stabilize that movement, and we'll look at that too. So we talked about the hip socket. It's a twisted band, kind of like those Chinese finger cuffs. And as we go into extension, that, if you imagine bringing the leg up into flexion, that capsule unwinds itself, and it makes it very free to move in flexion. When we go down into extension, the capsule rotates around itself and it tightens just like the finger cuffs. And it's why we can stand erect without a lot of muscle activity, because the ligament structure is supporting it. Someone with very hypermobile hips or ligament structure spends a little more time using muscles to stabilize their body inefficiently, but the ligaments are to create efficiency of stabilization in that extension position, which is why we get almost 120 degrees of hip flexion, but only about 10 degrees, 20 degrees of hip extension for that reason. And so the capsule can get tight. If someone has tight capsules, there are some joint mobilization exercises. You can look it up, but it's something to take into consideration. We also talked about the musculature and the center of gravity, but just giving you a quick overview of the joints itself from different views. Flexion is forward, extension is back relative to the pelvis, not the pelvis moving. And then again, as a component to hip extension, we also get external rotation of the femur. So we talked about the toe touch pattern. When we go into hip flexion, we're getting internal rotation of the femoral head. When we're going into hip extension, bending backward, the femoral head is externally rotating. So again, improving rotational components of the hip socket can improve the ability to flex and extend that hip. They go hand in hand with each other is what I'm getting at. And this is just another example of hip flexion extension, just getting a better picture of it. You can see how the head of the femur in this right slide middle picture, it looks like it wants to roll outward because we're going to hip extension. As we go into hip flexion, it wants to roll inward. So again, they're synonymous with each other. And this is just an example, a quick look at the internal and external rotation components. Now I've seen this measured a lot in a open chain, meaning the leg isn't touching anything. In flexion, remember in flexion we're going to see more range of motion than in extension because the hip socket is more locked. But the interesting part here is in a prone position with a hip in extension, we're unloaded though, it's still open chain. We're still getting 40 to 45 degrees of internal external rotation. Same with standing, unloaded, and then laying down here. So even though the hip socket, the ligament structure is supposed to tighten when the hip goes in extension, we still get a free range of motion of that hip, whatever position it's in. So keep that in mind. Internal rotation for toe touching, external rotation for hip, the backward bend. Hip internal external rotators. So a couple of tests that I don't do these often, perform these in physical therapy in the clinics, sports medicine. But this will help us determine capsular versus musculature. The Thomas test is one of the most common. The one knee's flexed in 120 degrees, pulling that low back flat into the table, and just seeing how far the leg drops. If the leg, and this is looking at true hip extension now because they're not able to get flexion because the other knee's up in the air. Keep that in mind when we go to corrective exercise. But if we're going past neutral, this guy you can see has about a 20 degrees of extension. And then we also look at how much the knee extends as the hip drops down. That would be an indication that it's not just hip flexor or adductors. It could have an implication of rectus femoris, which is a two-joint muscle, why we look at the knee position too. But just reference for you, the Thomas test is a great test to kind of differentiate between hip flexor, adductor, and rectus femoris, and even capsular tightness in the hip. When we look at the straight leg raise, we talked about this in the toe touch, and we're looking, and everyone tends to look at the leg that's coming up and the ability to move that leg. But what we also want to look at is as one leg's coming up in a flexion, the other one has to stay in extension. If someone has a restriction in hip extension, it may be why they don't get hip flexion. And so look at this person on the right, on the left, as they're bringing the leg straight up, the knee actually bends. His leg is going into hip flexion. Doesn't have the ability to keep that leg straight. Just keep that in mind. Again, our lack of ability to hip flexion may not even be because of hamstring tightness and weakness of the hip flexors, all those things we talked about in the toe touch pattern. It could be simply because of a lack of hip extension and that control of right to left hip movement, motor control. And the FMS test, it's critical that we watch this bottom leg for any movement, because any movement in that position would tell us that there's some tightness or restriction in hip extension. If you look at this is a person that's actually going hip extension on the right leg, hip flexion on the right, on the left, which is kind of like the Thomas test. Not that we use these, but it's just something to keep in mind, and if you want to break it down further, you can. I've always loved this picture. I'm just going to name this one fail. This was actually something I got off the internet, someone showing us how to do hip extension exercise for the glutes. And we see it all the time in the gym, the famous exercise for the booty. But you can see in this first starting position, his back is relatively neutral. And just imagine, the goal is to get hip extension. The prime mover is the glute. That's why people do this exercise for gluteal work, activation. But is he really getting hip extension? You can almost see the lines of his pants. His leg doesn't go anywhere into extension. It's just his lumbar spine that's collapsing. You can see the scapular winging here. So just keep this in mind when you see this movement. I can guarantee if we watch this person in a backward bend pattern, we probably see a lot of restriction in that hip socket. You aren't able to fake that. You can get a lot of lumbar extension, but you're not going to be able to get that true hip extension and watch the ASIS go forward. I'd mentioned to you that these patterns work off of each other, and that's why I wanted to show you the toe touching pictures again. When we see people that have pretty good toe touching patterns, we're looking at the symmetry of their spine throughout the whole upper back, lumbar and upper back. And if we see good movement here, we can expect to see, we wouldn't predict that we're going to see major problems in their backward bend. You might have it, but you already know they have a pretty good symmetry of their spine here. So there's no red flags jumping out to me when I move to the next test, which is the backward bend, from a person that has decent toe touching pattern or a good spinal alignment in their toe touching pattern. When I go to the people that are extremely in flexion, now a red flag's going off. I'm going to pay attention to this. And remember, this is one of the guys that was doing that backward bend pattern that had tremendous range of motion, but also look at how much range of motion he has in flexion. And he doesn't have a good hip hinge pattern. He has very poor hip hinge ability, but he's got tremendous hip extension. So again, nothing jumps out to me here. I'm just going to pay attention to it, because is this person truly in flexion, or is this like this person is just really mobile in the spine. This is the one that usually gives me the red flag. It's the ETK, the excessive thoracic kyphosis. And when I see a tremendous amount of thoracic extension relative to the lumbar and cervical areas, I'm going to be very keyed in on that when I watch the backward bend and make sure that you can almost predict, is this person going to go into excessive lumbar lordosis because of the inability to flex here? But again, like I said, it's just giving me a red flag. It doesn't tell me anything yet until I try it. But I'm keying in on this area of their upper back to make sure that they're getting true thoracic extension, because that's what we're really trying to look for in the backward bend pattern. Are they getting adequate 45 degrees of extension in the thoracic back? So again, the toe touching pattern is going to give me an indication of what I'm going to find in that backward bend, as well as the ankle mobility. Because as we go into backward bend, you're getting ankle dorsiflexion. You get that. Real quick, the backward bend assessment from an asymmetrical standpoint, we talked about it in the toe touching pattern. And so again, when I see an asymmetry in the toe touching pattern, a difference from one side to the other, meaning I see oversized musculature on one side of the erectors than the other side, or I see a difference in pelvic alignment, or even someone's thoracic tilt, it's going to key me into looking at something in their backward bend. It's a little more challenging to see asymmetries in the backward bend, but you can find them. And if you're suspecting it and you see it in the backward, in the toe touch, if you see it in a ankle mobility, someone's got a tremendous ankle mobility, I would break it out and use the single leg backward bend assessment. Single leg backward bend assessment is just an ancillary test. It's just to kind of confirm what we're seeing or what we're guessing. It doesn't have a result in the overall implication of the assessment results for corrective exercise, but it's confirming what we're seeing, and it's giving us an insight. So someone who has an asymmetry in their toe touch, it may come from one hip not being able to go into flexion or internal rotation. We also might find it if you're seeing something kind of weird throughout this pattern, then I would throw this in the single leg backward bend and just see if they're getting true hip extension on one side. Now, I will tell you this. In this position, if you tried it on yourself, the center of gravity is really getting thrown off, because not only is it balancing that backward bend has to balance, but you have to do it on one leg now. Still can put the foot down to support yourself, but we're looking at true hip extension. So the center of gravity gets out of place here, and I've seen people lose their balance a little bit more. So this could be a motor control problem, but a lot of times you're actually going to key in and find that external rotation or that or the hip extension problem here. It isolates it, obviously, right to left. Okay. So when it comes to musculature, where you might expect to see restrictions, obviously the abdominal cavity, the rectus abdominis, internal, external, and transverse obliques, they all have an implication on forward flexion, part of the kyphosis. So that's something to consider as far as why someone has a restriction in thoracic extension or hip extension. The anterior chain of the legs, we already talked about it, but the adductor group, our secondary hip flexors, they're pretty strong hip flexors, as well as adductors. They can aid a lot in hip flexion. And so is iliacus, the two primary hip flexors that are going to be highly restricted if someone has really tight hip flexors. And again, from sitting as much as we do, a typical type of sports that someone plays could create a lot of tightness in those hip flexors. As well as this is sartorius, the one that comes over the front of the hip, and rectus femoris, which is in the middle of the thigh. All of those are contributors to hip flexion, which also can be contributors to limitation in hip extension. So keep in mind, those muscles tend to be, and those can get very tight and dominant, especially those adductors. They can have an influence in the limitation of external rotation, because in the adductors are internal rotators. So if we're seeing someone with tight hips and extension go through a single leg test or even a standing rotation, will tell us that it's probably an adductor problem. If that makes sense. Real quick, adductor magnus. I just bring this up again. I talked a lot about this in the last toe touching pattern assessment series. But adductor magnus, the majority of the muscle is in the anterior compartment, so it's a hip flexor adductor. Then again, we mentioned the posterior portion of it attaches to the ischial tuberosity, and it has a contribution to hip extension. So the muscle is really a cool muscle in that it has kind of two origins, anterior and posterior along the pelvis, and can influence flexion and extension. But the adductor magnus can be very tight and restrict the ability to get external rotation of the femur. There's an interesting thing if you look at fascial lines and even muscle activations. The pec, the obliques, and then the ipsilateral or opposite side adductor are tied in together. And if you want to try a cool test, you see it a lot in throwers. In fact, I thought I had a throwing picture here. But if you think about throwing, the right arm goes back, you're stretching the pec, you're stretching the obliques, internal obliques, and the forward leg is the one that's extended out in front as you're throwing, so the adductor is a big part of that. So this kinetic chain, this line, this fascial line is all connected. Someone with thoracic tightness could have it tied into adductor tightness on the opposite side. So again, we never look at one part. We look at the entire chain in this segmental approach for the backward bend pattern. But this is a kind of a cool thing to start understanding. My fascial experts out there know these fascial lines, and they run obviously the entire length of the body. I just want to show you the main big muscles that are implicated in this stuff. And this is why I'm not a big fan of isolation muscle exercises. I'm a big fan of big movement exercises to incorporate anterior chains, posterior chains, and these fascial lines. I've included the synopsis of the lower extremities muscle chart, basically. Muscle responsible for hip extension, hip flexion, abduction, and internal rotation, etc. And just to give you an idea that if we're getting limitations in hip extension right here, then that means that these muscles may be underactive, they're not working very well. And this is just the hip, we're not looking at thoracic. And in the pelvis, these muscles may be overactive or tight, psoas, iliacus, sartorius, rectus femoris, the entire adductor group. And so it gives you kind of a place to start when we see hip extension problems. When it comes to thoracic, we've talked a lot about that with the shoulder girdle, and that's a lot of other stuff to go over. I have another chart for that. But anyway, this gives you a cheat sheet. If you're tight in external rotation, not able to externally rotate, you're not going to get hip extension. Well, then that must mean that your internal rotators are tight. That could be your adductor group medius minimus. There's some contribution there. Tensor fasciae lata, gracilis, pectineus. All these muscles are related to those tight adductors, and there's a little bit of contribution in the hamstrings. But I would be the biggest culprit here is probably going to be your adductor group for a tight internal rotator. So if someone doesn't get good hip extension, don't just blame it on the hip. It could be the adductor muscles are so tight they're not allowing the hip to go in external rotation, doesn't allow it to glide backward. Make sense? It's just a great cheat sheet for you and a reference for you guys. And this is just another way of looking at it with a different, same chart, but just differently laid out for you guys to use as a reference so you can understand what you're looking at and seeing and what muscle you can start thinking of are overactive and which ones need to be activated or stretched or whatever it may be. And again, I don't like stretching tight muscles. We have to go after the reason why they got tight. It's usually poor activation. And then just the posterior chain, again, those groups of muscles that tend to be maybe inactive or less active because of the postures and position we're in, all these muscles. And again, the latissimus tends to be pretty strong and tight on people, so just keep an eye on that. But even the erectors, again, we're not isolating groups, but those erector muscles can be underactive, especially if they have tremendous flexion in their body. So keep that in mind as we're doing the corrective exercise approach. And then obviously the posterior chain of musculature, the deep six, the glutes, the hamstrings, they all contribute to hip extension. They also have components of external rotation as well, so keep that in mind when you're looking at improving hip extension throughout the backward bend pattern. These muscles are important to activate and utilize. So when we get to that's why it leads me to the corrective exercise and why I chose these exercises. Starting off with the foot circle point flexes, I'm looking at the separation of the hips. And I'm really focusing on hip flexion and hip extension at the same time, priming the movement and actually getting some primary hip flexor engaged here. But I'm also just using this as a way to prime the hip to get moving, separating the hip. And then I obviously go into an external rotation pattern. There's a couple of different ways of doing this, but I like the hip crossover stretch a lot because it's activating the glute on the upside of the leg because you're pressing this knee out and you're getting the spinal rotation. If you think of this position, look at her right arm on the floor. You can see the twisting of her shirt that leads right down to the adductor. So this entire anterior fascial line is being stretched, and you can emphasize it even more by bringing the arm out higher, getting her into different postures of this. But again, I like this exercise a lot for the isolation of the glute on that upside, and you're encouraging external rotation. It's a primer to extension. Then we go into extension, glute extension, getting the glutes to fire, getting that posterior chain to fire, and using the strap to get out of any adductor engagement. Again, we're unloaded here though, and then I go after it, and I might actually add in a single leg hip glute activation pattern here, because pulling the knee into your chest, you're going to truly get hip extension. You'll find that people that can do the shoulder bridge get a lot of hip extension, and they're probably getting a lot of lumbar extension too. When they go into the single leg hip active bridge, shoulder bridge, you're going to see that hip hinge, that hip extension much less because they're truly getting hip extension now. It's just another good way to, instead of just stretching, you're actively stretching or activating those glute muscles. And I'll use the active straight leg raise in some cases just to get that hip separation, focusing on the down leg movement more so than the up leg. You're still getting the same effect. You're using you're using a lot of hip flexor here for activation, but you're also getting hip extension, and that's where it depends. I might not use this in some cases, but I use it quite often just to balance that hip flexion extension component out. And then I load the body. I go through a big spinal movement, hip extension movement here. If someone's extremely tight in their thoracic back, someone's extremely tight in hip extension, I usually won't go into this much of an extreme with them because all they're going to do is reinforce that lumbar extension. But if we're priming them for the movement of the hip socket and thoracic back through this patterns, you're going to find that the downward dog cobra is a good step to that. I'll mention one thing about the hip crossover. The hip crossover is also a great thoracic extension component. Improving thoracic extension is really more about rotation than it is extension. And I'll talk about that at another program. But remember, the thoracic back likes to go into flexion, extension, and then lastly, rotation. But when we do lateral rotation or rotation, we can get a lot of movement out of that spine into extension. So you don't have to just force extension like on a foam roller, which is great, but rotation is a big way to unlock the thoracic back. And then from here, then I get them loaded. I start going into, again, the disparity, the hip extension, tuck that butt under. You're really strongly getting a hip rectus femoris stretch here, as well as activation of this glute. So what a lot of people do is balance all their weight over their knee. This front leg is very light on the floor, and you're actually not just getting a stretch, we're trying to activate that glute, trying to get that glute to fire and keep them stabilized and balanced. Again, it's about the center of gravity redistribution as well. So the tricep stretch, and then if you look at the lat, you're getting some lat engagement, especially if you're forcing the lumbar spine into flexion. You're trying to tuck that butt under. Glute engagement is going to get posterior tilt. It's going to loosen. You're going to lose some of that lumbar extension, and then stretch the lat. This becomes a huge lat and hip flexor stretch while you're activating the glute, which is a great exercise, huge exercise for people. I go into the wall drop just because that backward bend has a component to hip ankle mobility, and so I'll throw a wall drop in whether it's in the beginning or the end. I usually like to do it in the end because it's a loaded position now. Once their hip is starting to learn how to move into a better position, we want to ensure that they're getting true dorsiflexion as well. And then I'll lock it all in with a kneeling ankle squeeze. Again, you're in hip extension. Really have them squeeze the pillow, which is encouraging gluteal engagement. Putting a stretch on the rectus because you're in your knees bent, the rectus femoris is going to pull on that pelvis, trying to increase the arch of the back, and then pressing with her hands into the block, you're going to get abdominal engagement. You can see how straight her spine is here, lumbar spine. It's not excessive, but she's in a good hip extension now. So now we've primed the body to get into this position. Now let's teach her what to do there, and we have to get the glutes to fire to get an extension. And I'll just share this with you. Just giving people glute exercises to create hip extension doesn't mean it's going to work, because if the hip can't go back into extension because of some restrictions in the adductors and stuff, you can try firing the glutes all day. It's not going to happen. So the idea of sequencing these exercises, getting them through a pattern so the body can start understanding what to do, is really the art of the corrective exercise approach. Hopefully that is a lot of information. There's probably an 8-hour course on itself, especially the shoulder girdle and the thoracic spine. But that is the backward bend pattern. I wanted you to get a lot more insight to what we're looking for. It's a valuable tool to move forward in the assessment, and a lot of information you gain from this can help you in determining what those corrective exercises are that you want to do with this person. So anyway, that's it. That's all I've got for you. I thank you for being on, and as always, I appreciate your time, and I'm excited to help you guys succeed. Take care.